Imagine reaching the end of your working life and discovering that there is no end. Your hands are swollen from decades of labor. Your back no longer straightens without pain. You cannot keep pace with younger workers, and your employer has no reason to keep you. There is no pension check, no retirement account, and no federal benefit waiting in the mail. You stop working only when your body makes the decision for you. Then you depend on your children, enter a county poorhouse, or fall into poverty. For most Americans, this was old age before 1935. The United States had existed for more than a century and a half without a national retirement system. There was no guaranteed income for older citizens and no broadly recognized point at which a worker had earned the right to rest. Retirement, as a normal stage of life, belonged mainly to people who had accumulated property or wealth. For everyone else, work and survival were almost indistinguishable. In colonial America and through much of the 19th century, most people lived within agricultural households. A farm did not separate employment from family life. Children worked beside parents, and older relatives continued contributing for as long as possible. When a farmer could no longer plow or lift heavy loads, he might repair tools, tend animals, shell corn, supervise children, or perform other lighter work. There was no formal retirement date. A person's duties simply changed as strength declined. The family served as the original old age security system. Adult children inherited the land and assumed responsibility for aging parents. Several generations often lived within the same household, sharing food, shelter, and labor. The arrangement could provide stability, but it depended on children surviving, remaining nearby, and having enough resources to support another person. If those conditions failed, there was very little beneath them. Industrialization weakened the family system. During the 19th century, young Americans left farms and small towns for factories in New York, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and other growing cities. The same economic transformation that created industrial wealth separated parents from the children who might once have cared for them. Factory work also changed the value assigned to an aging body. Industrial employers wanted speed, strength, and endurance. Shifts lasting 12 hours or more were common, and safety protections were minimal. By 1900, industrial accidents were killing tens of thousands of American workers each year and injuring hundreds of thousands more. There was no comprehensive workers' compensation or disability system. A person who lost a hand in a mill or suffered a disabling injury in a mine could lose wages immediately and permanently. Workers who escaped injury still faced dismissal as they aged. A trembling hand, failing eyesight, or a damaged back could make decades of experience irrelevant. Employers could replace an older worker without severance, pension, or legal obligation. For elderly Americans without savings or family support, the final public institution was the poorhouse. Also called an almhouse or poor farm, it was usually operated by a county or municipality. It was not designed to provide a dignified retirement. It was designed to contain dependency at the lowest possible cost. The system reflected a moral judgment about poverty. Political leaders often treated need as evidence of laziness, irresponsibility, or defective character. Assistance was deliberately humiliating so that only the desperate would seek it. Residents were commonly called inmates. Inside, the elderly lived beside orphan children, people with disabilities, those suffering from mental illness, alcoholics, and others whom local authorities did not know how or did not wish to support. Sanitation was poor, food was inadequate, privacy was rare, and trained medical care was often non-existent. An older widow who had spent her life raising children or taking in laundry could end her days in a crowded dormitory beside strangers. A former laborer whose body had been destroyed by work could be required to perform more labor in exchange for a bed and thin meals. Some facilities operated farms and expected residents to work the land to offset the cost of their own confinement. Institutions such as the Tewksbury Almhouse in Massachusetts, Bellevue Almhouse in New York, and the Cook County Poorhouse near Chicago became symbols of a system built around containment rather than care. Reformer Dorothea Dix documented neglect and abuse in jails and almshouses, describing institutions where vulnerable people were restrained, mistreated, and abandoned without proper supervision. These were not isolated scandals. By the middle of the 19th century, poorhouses existed across much of the country. Their presence shaped the fears of working families. The poorhouse represented more than poverty. It represented the loss of independence, privacy, reputation, and social worth. To enter, one was to be officially classified as a burden. The fear followed workers through their entire adult lives. Saving was not simply preparation for comfort. It was an attempt to avoid institutional disgrace. Families hid need for as long as possible because requesting public relief could mean surrendering property, independence, and sometimes the right to make basic decisions. County officials might investigate relatives to determine whether they could be forced to provide support before admitting an elderly applicant. Once inside, residents could lose control over where they slept, what they ate, and how they spent their remaining years. The poorhouse therefore disciplined people who never entered it. Its misery communicated a warning to every laborer: remain productive, remain dependent on family, or accept humiliation. Yet the warning ignored the economic reality that many wages barely covered immediate survival. Workers could be industrious for 50 years without accumulating enough to finance 10 years without employment. Illness, injury, a spouse's death, or a failed harvest could erase what little had been saved. The system demanded self-reliance while withholding the income and security that made self-reliance possible. Some Americans found better protection through mutual aid. Fraternal orders, churches, ethnic associations, and benevolent societies collected dues from members during their working years. Groups such as the Oddfellows, the Masons, and Irish, German, Jewish, and other community organizations provided sickness benefits, burial assistance, or housing in old age. Some built homes for elderly members that offered far better conditions than county institutions. By the late 19th century, Brooklyn contained numerous religious and fraternal homes, including the Baptist Home, the Brooklyn Home for the Aged, and the German Evangelical Home. The Little Sisters of the Poor opened a home in Washington, D.C. in 1873 and cared for aging men and women across religious and racial lines. These organizations demonstrated that risk could be shared. Members contributed while healthy and received support when illness or age reduced their independence. But the protection was limited. A person had to belong to the right organization, live near its facilities, and remain part of a community capable of financing care. Millions of workers possessed no such connection. As reformers gradually removed children and some people with mental illness from poorhouses, the population left behind became increasingly elderly. America's default retirement institution was becoming a warehouse for people who had outlived their capacity to earn wages. Other industrial nations began moving in a different direction. In 1889, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck introduced the first national old age social insurance system. Bismarck was not a socialist reformer motivated primarily by compassion. He was a conservative statesman attempting to weaken the appeal of Germany's growing socialist movement. Repression had failed to eliminate worker unrest, so he offered social protection as a reason for laborers to remain loyal to the state. The pension was both policy and political strategy. Eligibility initially began at age 70. Because many workers would never survive long enough to collect benefits, the state could promise security while limiting immediate costs. Germany later reduced the age to 65 in 1916. That number gradually became an international reference point. Britain, France, Austria, Sweden, and other nations established various forms of old age disability or social insurance during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Governments increasingly accepted that industrial economies created risks families and charities could not manage alone. The United States remained resistant. A few American employers introduced pensions. American Express established an early private plan in 1875, and other large corporations eventually followed. These benefits covered only a small share of the workforce. They were voluntary, controlled by employers, and often lacked legal protection. A company could change the terms, dismiss a worker before eligibility, or terminate the plan. By 1932, only about 15% of American workers had access to an employer pension. Civil War pensions represented the federal government's largest early experience with long-term benefits. Disabled Union veterans and later many widows and dependents could receive payments connected to military service. At its peak, the program consumed a significant share of federal spending. But it was tied to one war and one category of service. It did not establish a general right to income in old age. Some states adopted old age pension laws, especially during the early 1930s. On paper, the movement appeared substantial. By 1935, 30 states had enacted some form of pension legislation. In reality, only a tiny fraction of older Americans received benefits. Requirements were restrictive, funding was weak, and average payments could amount to roughly 65 cents a day. The state programs did not offer security. They offered limited relief after poverty had already arrived. America's resistance came from several sources. Individualism shaped political culture. Many leaders insisted that adults were responsible for saving for their own old age and that government assistance would weaken character. Poverty was described as personal failure even when low wages made meaningful savings impossible. Business interests also opposed social insurance. A pension financed through payroll contributions would increase labor costs and invite federal regulation. Employers accustomed to discarding workers when they were no longer useful resisted responsibility for what happened afterward. Constitutional doubts added another barrier. Critics argued that the federal government lacked authority to create a national pension, and that welfare remained a responsibility of the states under the 10th Amendment. Together, ideology, economic power, and legal uncertainty delayed reform while other nations built national systems. Then the Great Depression destroyed the arrangements Americans had been told to rely upon. After 1929, banks failed by the thousands and took household savings with them. National output collapsed. Wages fell. Unemployment rose above 25%. Older workers suffered with particular severity. They were often the first dismissed and the least likely to be rehired. Employers facing lines of desperate applicants preferred younger bodies capable of longer hours. A worker over 50 who lost a job could search for months without receiving serious consideration. Savings that might have supported retirement vanished in bank failures. Homes were threatened by foreclosure. Families already supporting unemployed children could not absorb aging parents. Charities, fraternal organizations, and local governments were overwhelmed. The Depression did not create elderly poverty. It exposed and multiplied it. By 1934, more than half of older Americans lacked enough income to support themselves. Men who had built railroads and factories rode freight trains in search of food. Families crowded several generations into small rooms. Soup kitchens ran out of meals. Older women searched through refuse for anything they could eat or sell. The country could no longer pretend that poverty in old age resulted only from bad choices. People who had worked, saved, raised families, and followed every rule were being destroyed by forces beyond their control. In 1933, an unemployed 66-year-old doctor named Francis Townsend looked from the rear window of his home in Long Beach, California. Near his garbage cans, he saw 3 elderly women in torn clothing searching for food. Townsend had witnessed suffering throughout the Depression, but the sight of those women reduced the entire crisis to one unbearable image. They had survived long enough to grow old in one of the richest nations on earth, and this was what the nation offered them. Townsend sat down and began to write. Francis Townsend's proposal began with a letter. He argued that every American over the age of 60 should receive $200 each month from the federal government. The amount was enormous by Depression-era standards, equal to several $1,000s in modern purchasing power. The payment came with 2 conditions. Recipients had to retire completely, and they had to spend the entire sum within 30 days. The first condition was intended to remove older workers from the labor market and create openings for younger people. The second was the heart of Townsend's economic theory. He believed that forcing retirees to spend their pensions quickly would pour money into shops, restaurants, factories, and farms. Demand would rise, businesses would hire, and the economy would begin moving again. He called it the Old Age Revolving Pension Plan. Townsend proposed financing the program through a 2% national sales tax. Economists immediately identified a problem. The numbers did not work. Paying $200 each month to every American over 60 would consume an enormous share of the national economy. The proposed tax would not generate enough revenue to support the benefits. As fiscal policy, the plan was deeply flawed. As political organizing, it was extraordinary. Townsend's letter gave older Americans something they had never possessed as a group, a national voice. The response overwhelmed him. Within months, his office in Long Beach was reportedly receiving thousands of letters each day. Townsend clubs appeared across the country. They operated as meeting halls, campaign offices, and social centers where elderly Americans could gather, discuss their conditions, recruit supporters, and circulate petitions. For people who had spent their lives treated as dependents or private family burdens, the clubs created a new identity. They were not isolated old men and women who had individually failed to save. They were citizens experiencing the same structural crisis. By 1936, Townsend's organization claimed more than 3.5 million members. Its petitions reportedly carried more than 20 million signatures, over 1/10 of the American population. The movement was larger than many labor and unemployment campaigns of the era. It marked the emergence of older Americans as a distinct political force capable of influencing elections and frightening members of Congress. Washington could dismiss Townsend's mathematics. It could not ignore his followers. Franklin D. Roosevelt already believed some form of social insurance was necessary. His Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, had been pressing the issue since before his inauguration. Perkins was the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet. Long before Social Security became law, she had studied labor conditions, industrial accidents, unemployment, and the weaknesses of America's relief systems. In February 1933, she met with Roosevelt at his home and presented a list of measures she hoped the new administration would pursue. Among them were unemployment insurance, old age protection, and a minimum wage. The ideas were ambitious, but the political pressure surrounding them was growing. Townsend's movement presented Roosevelt with a choice. The administration could offer a moderate, financially structured retirement system, or it could leave the field to proposals that promised far more and attracted millions of desperate supporters. Perkins later recalled Roosevelt warning that Congress could not withstand the pressure of the Townsend Plan unless the administration developed a serious Social Security proposal of its own. The president did not merely fear Townsend, other populist movements were gaining strength as well. Senator Huey Long of Louisiana promoted his Share Our Wealth program, which promised to redistribute fortunes and guarantee substantial household incomes. Across the country, Americans who believed the existing economic system had abandoned them were embracing increasingly radical alternatives. Roosevelt understood that reform could preserve the political order as effectively as repression. In June 1934, he issued an executive order establishing the Committee on Economic Security. Francis Perkins served as chair. The committee's assignment was immense: design an American social insurance system from the ground up. It had approximately 6 months. Researchers examined European programs, state pension laws, unemployment systems, actuarial projections, and possible methods of taxation. They had to create a plan broad enough to matter but restrained enough to survive Congress, constitutional scrutiny, and opposition from business. One of the most consequential decisions concerned age. At what point should the federal government recognize a person as retired? Germany had originally set eligibility at 70 before reducing it to 65. Existing American state pension programs were divided, with some using 65 and others 70. The recently established Federal Railroad Retirement System also used 65. The committee's financial calculations favored the same threshold. Beginning payments at 65 reduced the number of immediate beneficiaries and made the program more manageable under modest payroll tax rates. The choice was administrative and actuarial, but its cultural influence would become enormous. 65 became the age Americans associated with retirement. It was not a natural dividing line written into human biology. It was a policy decision shaped by budgets, precedent, and political compromise. On January 15, 1935, the Committee on Economic Security delivered its final report to Roosevelt. 2 days later, the president sent the Social Security proposal to Congress. The debate was fierce. Opponents called the program socialism. Business groups warned that payroll contributions would burden employers, discourage hiring, and undermine individual responsibility. Critics argued that the federal government was entering an area properly reserved for states and families. Some objected on constitutional grounds. The Supreme Court had already struck down important parts of the New Deal, and no one could be certain that a national retirement program would survive judicial review. So supporters answered that the old system had already failed. Family care, charity, poorhouses, private pensions, and state relief had left millions of elderly Americans destitute. The Depression had demonstrated that savings could disappear, employment could collapse, and individual discipline could not protect people from a national economic catastrophe. The Townsend movement added urgency to every congressional calculation. Lawmakers who resisted Roosevelt's proposal risked strengthening demands for a much larger and more expensive alternative. A moderate federal insurance program began to appear less radical when compared with the promises circulating outside Washington. After months of negotiation, Congress approved the legislation. On August 14, 1935, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act in the cabinet room of the White House. Francis Perkins stood nearby as the president placed his name on the law. The measure was immediately recognized as one of the most important achievements of the New Deal. Its significance extended beyond the benefits it initially provided. The federal government had accepted responsibility for creating a permanent system of economic protection against old age. But the original law was far narrower than the program Americans would later know. It provided retirement benefits only to the primary wage earner. There were no benefits for spouses, surviving family members, or dependent children. Those protections were added through amendments in 1939. Large categories of workers were excluded. Agricultural laborers and domestic workers did not receive coverage under the original system. Neither did many self-employed professionals. These omissions disproportionately affected Black and Latino workers, especially in the South. The exclusions were not random administrative oversights. Roosevelt needed the votes of Southern Democrats, who held enormous power in Congress. Those lawmakers wanted to preserve the racial and economic structure of the Jim Crow South, where black workers were heavily concentrated in domestic service and agriculture. Leaving those occupations outside the system helped secure passage. The compromise placed some of the country's poorest and most physically exploited workers beyond the reach of its newest safety net. Health insurance was also absent. Perkins had hoped to include a national medical program, influenced partly by systems developing abroad. But the American Medical Association and other powerful groups opposed federal involvement in healthcare. Rather than risk the entire Social Security proposal, the administration removed national health insurance. Older Americans would have to wait another 30 years for Medicare. The law's financial structure also delayed its immediate effects. Payroll taxes began before monthly retirement benefits did. The first regular payments were not issued until January 1940, nearly 5 years after Roosevelt signed the legislation. The first monthly check went to Ida Mae Fuller, a retired legal secretary from Ludlow, Vermont. Her payment was 22,054 cenders. Fuller had contributed a total of 75 cenders through payroll taxes over approximately 3 years. She lived to the age of 100 and collected nearly $23,000 in benefits during her lifetime. Her case became a famous illustration of the early program's design. The first generation of beneficiaries could receive far more than they had directly contributed because the system was not structured as a collection of individual savings accounts. Current workers financed current retirees while earning eligibility for their own future benefits. That principle distinguished Social Security from private retirement savings. It was social insurance. The system pooled risk across generations and across the workforce. It recognized that no person could know exactly how long they would live, whether savings would survive inflation or financial collapse, or whether illness would destroy their ability to work. The constitutional challenge soon reached the Supreme Court. In 1937, the court upheld major portions of the Social Security Act in 2 related decisions. The rulings resolved, at least legally, the argument that had delayed federal action for decades. The national government possessed the authority to establish the program. With the constitutional question settled, Social Security began expanding. The 1939 amendments added benefits for spouses, children, and survivors, shifting the program from a narrow worker pension toward broader family protection. Later reforms extended coverage to additional occupations, including many farm workers, self-employed people, nonprofit employees, and others excluded from the original law. Disability insurance was added. Workers were eventually allowed to claim reduced retirement benefits before 65, beginning at age 62. Medicare followed in 1965, adding health insurance for older Americans to the federal structure that retirement benefits had created. The system became far more comprehensive than the one Roosevelt signed, yet its greatest transformation was cultural. Before 1935, most Americans did not experience retirement as a defined and expected period of life. Old age usually meant continued work, family dependence, charity, or institutional poverty. Social Security helped create a new sequence. People would work during adulthood, contribute through payroll taxes, and eventually leave the labor force with a dependable monthly income. Retirement became a normal stage of the American life cycle. The idea that a person could put down tools after decades of labor and live without complete dependence on children was not inevitable. It had to be created through legislation and sustained through taxation. It represented a new social bargain. Workers contributed while employed. In exchange, the nation promised that old age would not automatically mean abandonment. The benefit was never intended to make every retiree wealthy. It was designed to create a floor, an income beneath which older Americans would be less likely to fall. That floor dramatically reduced poverty, but it did not erase inequality. People excluded from early coverage lost years of potential benefits. Workers with low lifetime wages received lower checks. Women who spent years outside paid employment caring for children often depended on spousal provisions rather than benefits based on their own earnings. Racial inequality built into the labor market carried into retirement. Even as coverage approached universality, the program reflected the earnings histories of a country in which opportunity had never been distributed equally. Still, Social Security became one of the most effective anti-poverty programs in American history. Today, according to the supplied script, it keeps roughly 22 million Americans out of poverty. Its popularity rests partly on the way it is financed. Workers see payroll deductions throughout their careers and understand benefits as something they have earned. That language matters. Critics sometimes call Social Security an entitlement, using the term to suggest an undeserved government payment. Legally, however, entitlement means that eligible people possess a right to benefits under the law. Recipients are entitled because they contributed to the system and met its conditions. The arguments raised in 1935 never disappeared. Opponents still describe the program as an improper expansion of government. Proposals repeatedly emerged to reduce benefits, raise the retirement age, change the formula, or shift part of the system into private investment accounts. Supporters answer by pointing to the world that existed before it. Without a national floor, retirement security depended on wealth, family luck, or charity. Workers with low wages could labor for an entire lifetime without accumulating enough to survive when employment ended. The result was not a nation of universally independent elders. It was poorhouses, multi-generational desperation, and older people searching garbage for food. The history of Social Security is therefore not only the history of a federal program, it is the history of a moral decision. For more than a century, America treated the suffering of elderly workers as a private problem. Families were expected to absorb it, charities to soften it, and poorhouses to contain whatever remains. The Depression made that arrangement impossible to defend. Millions of people discovered that personal responsibility could not protect them from bank failures, unemployment, collapsing wages, and economic forces larger than any household. Townsend's plan did not become law. Its mathematics were too extreme and its financing too weak. But the movement accomplished something more important. It forced the government to see older Americans as an organized constituency whose suffering could no longer be ignored. 3 women searching through refuse helped inspire a proposal. That proposal created a national movement. The movement increased pressure on Roosevelt. Roosevelt empowered Perkins and the Committee on Economic Security. Their work became the Social Security Act. Retirement did not simply appear as society became richer. It emerged from political struggle. It was demanded by people who had worked until their bodies failed and refused to accept that poverty was the only reward available at the end. The program they helped create was incomplete, unequal, and shaped by painful compromises. But it changed what growing old could mean. Before Social Security, old age was often a private catastrophe. Afterward, it became a public responsibility.